I love using centers in my elementary music room, but one of the main concerns when it comes to centers is classroom management. Classroom management is just how your classes run, how to, handle everybody and make sure that everybody knows what to do and where they're going and all of that important stuff. It also means making sure that everyone is behaving correctly, and centers can be kind of difficult because when you're doing centers, the kids are all spread out and you can't physically watch them all at the same time. So in this video, we're gonna talk about classroom management for centers specifically and talk about all the things that will help you to have a well-run class even during centers. Yes, that is possible. Before we get started, there's two things I wanna mention. Number one is that I have a whole ultimate guide to music center ideas that you can get for free down in the link in my description. It's a PDF. It has 12 pages full of ideas for centers activities, including things like melody activities, rhythm activities. It's got links to all the different things, instruments, the orchestra, music terms, like all the things, and a lot of them are like very easy to prep and really easy to set up. So make sure you click the link down below to grab that. The second thing I want to tell you before we get into all of the stuff coming next is that with classroom management, sometimes when you hear other people talk about their classroom management, it can be really easy to be like, oh, well, you're not at my school. Like, you don't understand. Like, that might work for your students, but it's not going to work for mine. So before we even get into it, I just want to mention, if you are having those thoughts, I probably do work at your school. Maybe not your physical school, but like the equivalent, but in Savannah. So I work at a school that is not known for being a good school. Actually, very much the opposite. I like literally when I tell people where I look, I've had people be like, why? I don't say that to mean anything mean. I love my school, I love my kids, but it is definitely a difficult place to work. It is not for everybody, and it takes a lot of extra thought in the classroom management department. And so I'm telling you that because I don't want you to think I'm like up in this ivory tower like, oh, my children are perfect and wonderful. No. My children are not perfect and they're not wonderful. I love them. But this is something like we work with a lot, and we're still able to do centers. So you are able to do centers. I'm here with you. I'm in the trenches. I understand. Let's get into it. All right, now, first things first, before you even get into classroom management in centers, you need to have a classroom management plan. That means that you need to form relationships with your kids. You need to have routines in your class. You need to have expectations in your class. And you have to have some sort of system for what happens if students are following the system, are not following the system. All of these things are absolutely fundamental. This is not what we're going to talk about today, so I will link some videos about that down below. But if you don't already have a classroom management system in place, everything else is gonna not work. So get that in place first, and then let's talk about centers, which we can get into now. Before we start with our centers, we have certain things that we talk about with the expectations. So when we are about to do centers, I always go through our 4 centers expectations. Now we have our classroom expectations. Centers expectations are a little more specific. So we still have our 4 things we do in music: follow directions, be respectful, be responsible, be a participant. But in centers, it's a little bit different. So centers, I always make the kids repeat them so that it actually gets in their brain. So we do work the whole time, be respectful to your group, do not leave your group, and voices on level 2. These are our 4 things that are specific to centers, and having those really specific things make a huge difference. I've been doing centers for years. This is the first year I've implemented this, and it like made a world of difference. Just having those very specific things that kids know that they are supposed to or not supposed to do really helps them. I also tell them that if they are doing those 4 things, it helps us earn extra points for game time on Friday, because we do a teacher versus student points situation, and it helps them earn their dojos for the day. So if you don't know what those are, it helps them earn rewards. One of the biggest problems with centers is the rotations. So once you have, everyone together, you need to be able to rotate to the next rotation without like everyone totally losing their mind. So what we do is I have a timer on the board. When the timer goes off, then I say 1, 2, 3, 4, put everything down, get off the floor, and freeze. I also hit a 1-minute timer that times them getting cleaned up. So when that 1-minute timer goes off, they know that they need to be cleaned up and frozen. And I give them a point for our teacher versus student points if they beat the clock, but they have to be frozen. And I'm emphasizing that because it's important. Because if they are moving around, then one, they're not gonna pay attention. Two, I can't tell if they're cleaned up and ready to move. Three, it means there's just too much chaos in the room. So if they're like moving around, we're not moving. You do not count for points until you are frozen like a statue. When they're frozen, it is much easier to get them to like do the right things because they're frozen. I always emphasize freeze with like, and look at me, so that they're, you know, just not moving. There's just less happening. When it comes to classroom management, that's a big thing. It's like, I want less happening in the room right now. After that, I show them where they go. So I say, point up to the sky, and then I'll be like, okay, red group, point to the yellow group point to the whatever. I have hula hoops on the ground with different colors, which is where the colors come from. Once they're all pointing, still frozen, then I say 5, 6, 7, 8, hurry, don't be late. They go to their next station and they get to work. I often remind them, like, do not run into anybody, do not step on anything, like all of that kind of stuff before we rotate. Just, you know, certain classes need extra reminders than others. And if there are concerns about that, then I'll be a little more structured and I'll be like, okay, you move here, and doing one group at a time can kind of bring that crazy level down a little bit. But I've done it enough that we're able to switch fairly okay. I also plant myself in the middle of all of the rotation. That way the kids cannot do things without me noticing because I'm right in the middle. I'm not over off in a corner staring at them because then they're gonna think that I can't see them even though I can. The closer you are to the students, the better they will behave. When it comes to materials and centers, this can be a big, huge thing. First of all, I will say we don't use things I am concerned about them breaking. So we're not using nice instruments. We're not, you know, none of that kind of stuff. You know what we use in centers? We use laminated paper, we use pencils. Sometimes we use, you know, like a dice or something like that, or counters or something like that, depending on the class. Sometimes I don't. And then if we're using instruments, it'll be like castanets, rhythm sticks, or I usually keep a set of old things. So like I just got new rhythm sticks and I kept my old rhythm sticks, and those are gonna be our centers ones because I'm not concerned about them breaking. So that's number one. Now, number two is with our materials, I put everything into a clear plastic shoebox, and that is the shoebox for that center. Everything goes in the shoebox. At the end, everything goes back in the shoebox. When the timer goes off, you put everything in the shoebox. That helps everything stay contained in their area. I also make a big deal about, you know, not taking things so that hopefully people do not steal my pencils and stuff like that as well. We also talked beforehand about, you know, what is okay and not okay in centers. Like, do we throw materials? Do we break materials? And all of those kind of things, just so that it's top of mind. Now, does it prevent everybody? No. But if you do it, then you will have a yellow card. You will sit out by yourself. And I usually keep packets of work that usually they don't even do if they get in trouble, but I just keep them so that I can hand them to them when they get in trouble. And I'm like, you can do paperwork instead of doing all of our fun games and stuff. Also, again, don't put anything nice in there. For dice, if you're doing a dice game, you can put dice inside of like little tiny containers, like the condiment containers, so they can shake them in the container and you can see it, but then it's just a little bit bigger. So one, they don't go flying as much, and two, they're harder to stick in your pocket. And the other thing is you can get like giant dice, and that also helps, again, with not throwing them across the room or stealing them. So two little things for that. Typically I do a teacher group in my centers, but on the first day of centers I don't do a teacher group because I want to make sure that we get our rituals, our routines, our that kind of stuff all figured out. So on the first day of centers every year, I do not have a teacher group. I walk around the whole time and make sure everyone is on task and everybody is figuring things out. On the other days when I do have a teacher group, I sit, how do I explain this? I have like a carpet in the front where my teacher group sits. I sit in my chair usually, like in front of the carpet, in between them and the next center, okay? Then I have another center over here, and I do two doing the same thing, two doing the same thing, and then two at the teacher group. So I'm in between the teacher group and this center. We'll call it like teacher group and center one. And then there's center two. So that way I'm like in close proximity to 4 of the groups. The sneaky thing I do with this is that if there's anything I'm concerned about for materials, I put them at that center 1 because I'm right next to them. The center 2 in the back gets things that are all paper or that are like paper pencil activities or things like that with less materials because I'm further away from them and I can't see them. So be strategic about where you sit in the classroom so that you can see everyone and keep an eye on as much as possible. Now, there are sometimes some students that are just not going to make it happen, and whether that is because they're being rude to their classmates, whether they're just all over the place, whether they're throwing things, whatever it is, I already told you, I literally keep packets of paperwork and I tell them in the beginning, I'm like, if you can't handle yourself, you're gonna go sit by yourself in the audience. I call it the audience because you get to watch, but you don't get to participate. And you're gonna do paperwork instead of all the fun games and all the fun things that we have. I try to make centers fun so that you want to be a part of centers and you don't want to have to sit out. And yes, I do actually use them sometimes. Usually the kids don't do any of the paperwork because if they're extra frustrated enough to not want to do things in centers and they're also frustrated because they got kicked out, then they're usually not going to want to follow directions. But I don't actually care. What I care about is that you get the point that next time you need to be a little bit better in your centers. For students who just can't do it on that particular day, that's what happens to them. Also, when it comes to centers, always pick the groups yourselves and be very strategic about who goes where. So make sure that you're picking your groups ahead of time and that you're separating anybody who needs to be separated. Like I have particular, you know, images in my brain right this second of people that I needed to go in a very specific group. So if I have one friend who's, you know, maybe a little extra fun, I'm gonna put that friend with a couple of like really on it kids so that they can keep them on track, or at least they won't get pulled off track by the student who is off track. Does that make sense? Like, be very strategic with who you put where and what's going on in all of the groups. I don't suggest centers until about a month into class so that you know your kids well enough that you can do that and be strategic about that, but just, you know. Now, let's talk worst case scenario, because I have had classes that I have not felt comfortable doing centers with. And so a couple of options for those classes that you're just like, you know what? I don't think this is gonna go well to do instead. Number one, you can do less centers. So one easy starting place is to have half the class doing one thing and half the class doing another thing, and then you switch halfway through. That's one easy way to kind of like manage the situation a little bit better. Number two is you could do centers, but instead of moving the students, you can move the centers. So instead of having, you know, this group go to that group, I physically, or a kid physically, picks up the bucket of stuff and takes it to the next center. That way there's not people moving all around, milling all around and all over the place. The actual centers are moving instead of the students. So that's a really good accommodation if you just need a little less chaos. Number three is you can still do centers activities, not as centers. So you can either have, you know, everyone in groups all doing, you know, like I'm thinking my favorite game is Kaboom. So like we're all doing Kaboom, but you're in your separate groups, but we're all doing the same thing. So there's just a little less chaos going on. Or you can do some of the stuff whole group. So instead of doing it as a center, just do it as a whole group activity. That way you can keep a little bit of a better eye on students. So I'm thinking like if you're doing manipulatives on the staff, that's something you can totally do whole group instead of small group, and that might be a little easier in particular classes. Another option that I've used, especially with the littles, is having all of the students doing something very simple and then calling a group up to do something different. So for example, I've done this a lot with second grade, and so I'll give everyone like a color by note sheet where they're coloring, you know, the TTs and the TAs and the whatevers, and they're doing that and they're occupied, and then I call certain students up to do a different activity with me. They go back, I call another group, they go back, I call another group, and that way you can still, you know, continue to do like centers, especially if you want to do that teacher group, that differentiating, and without all of the chaos. The caveat to this is that whatever the kids are doing has to be simple enough that they can do it on their own, and it has to be something that will take enough time for them to finish, which is why I like coloring activities, because it takes them a while to like color all the things. I have a lot of color by notes in my shop with both solfege and treble clef and rhythm, so I will link those down below if that is something you're interested in. And lastly, if it's really not gonna work, don't do centers. There are some classes I don't do centers with because like they just don't get along, or they're just all over the place all of the time and it's just too chaotic. You're not a bad teacher if you have a class that you don't do centers with. Now, I wouldn't say shy away from centers from everybody, but again, if you have a class or even a grade level that's just like, it's gonna be too much, then don't do it. Pick whoever is going to work the best and start with them, and then you can add more later, or maybe next year they'll be calmer or something like that. It is okay. I have had many, many, many days that I have had to change my lesson plan because what I wanted to do wasn't gonna work. That's okay. That happens, especially at schools like ours. So just be aware that like that is okay. It's not the end of the world if you don't do centers with certain classes or with certain grade levels. I would love to know what some of your classroom management tips for centers are, so leave those down below in the comments. I will link that whole list as well as my centers playlist and my classroom management playlist in the description in case you want some more help, and I will see you guys next time. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're an elementary music teacher, because we talk about elementary music stuff all the time and I have a lot of videos. So hit the subscribe button and then I will see you next time. Bye!